Hilchos Gerushin, Perek Chamishi. We learned before the halachas of the ksivas haget, that the get, how the get should be written, with what it has to be b'dioy and ksav shein yochel izdayev. We learned about the din lishma. Now the Rambam is going to talk about the din of the nesinus haget, v'nosan biyoda. Zeh shenamer b'teira v'nosan biyoda, ein inyan hakasuv ela sheyagia haget lo. Even though it says biyoda, but it doesn't have to be mamish biyoda. It has to be the get should reach her. V'echad yoda, eicheka, eichatzera, eishlucha she'asa yodi ki yoda, hakel echadu. As long as it reached her, either reached her by mamish yad or cheka, chatzera, or her shliach. V'echad chatzera knuyaloi, chatzera muskeres, eishulalo, m'sheyagia get l'shusin is garsha. So you can be megarish sheisha by the get coming into her chatzer, into her shus. Hazere get liishte l'tei chatzera. Sim hoise imedes sham betzad chatzera nisgarsha. She has to be imedes betzad chatzera in order to be misgarish through throwing it into chatzera. V'im lav le nisgarsha ad shetamid betzad chatzera. V'afal pi sheichotza mishtamer sheishtamer aget betecha. And the din is that chotza mishtameres is kaina for a person even when he's not there. And the pshat is that over there the pshat is azay, because the Gemara says that chotzer mishum shliachis raboy, chotzer mishum yodis raboy, v'ligara mishlucha. Whereas a chotzer could also act as a shliach. If it's a chotzer mishtamer, it could act as a shliach. But when could it act as a shliach? L'gabi dinamam is to be kind of something, because it's a schus, and maybe you could be kind of through a shliach. So al derech zeh the chotzer could be kind of for the person something which is a schus for him. Mashayin a get normally is considered a chayiv. So therefore, a get can't act as a shliach for the isha because ein chavan l'adam ela b'fanav. So therefore, it could only act as a yad, and for a yad you have to be aimed a little bit tzida. That's what he's saying. Leinas garsha ad shetamid b'tzad chatzera v'aval pi sheichotzer sheishtamer haget b'techa, and l'chura such a chotzer as a din of a shliach. The answer is no. Shechevi lo agerushin. It's in from chev. Ein chavan l'adam ela b'fanav. So therefore, the chotzer can act as a shliach. It has to only act as a yad. And that's only when she's oimed b'tzida. Now, L'peil taka the Rishonim bring, and so Yishalmi, that if she would say b'feider zeikli get b'chatzeri, so then he could be zeirik the get in the chotzer, even if she's not oimed b'tzida, because then she b'feider was mamana, the chotzer is a shliach. The Rambam doesn't say that, but that's what's brought down in Rishonim. Halacha gimel. Hoysa oimedes b'reish hagag shelo, v'hu milmata b'chatzeri, v'zorke lo l'mayla. So he threw the get milmata l'mayla. Is kivin shehigia la'aver mechitzas hamaika. So that it was assuming that this gag has a maika, and it reaches the aver mechitzas hamaika. In other words, it already is on its way down. In other words, first it has to obviously go up, and then it has to start going down. He has to go over the mechitzas hamaika and then start being on its way down over the gag. So kivin shehigia la'aver mechitzas hamaika. If the maika has mechitzas, if the gag has mechitzas, it has a maika. Lepachis mishleshet tvachim samach legag. If there's no roof, so if it reached already pachis from 3 tvachim samach legag, isn't his garshim. At that point in time was chal de gerushin. That's considered that it reached her. It reached her chatzir. It reached her. She's standing on the gag. Aber bulvad on the condition that she yanuach, that the pale mamish was taka yanuach. In other words, at that point in time it was taka in his garish, but only on the condition that later on it was yanuach. If something happened, it reached Taka the Aver Mechitzas Hamaika. But on the other hand, later on something happened and it was never noch. Al derech zeh, if it reached Samuch Pachas Mishleshet Tvachim Samuch to the Gag, and Lepel at the end it was not noch. Avalim Nimchak in Nisraf Kedem Shiagielo is Aval Pisha Nimchak. La'achar shehigia la'aver mechitzes, la'achar shehigia lepachas mishleshet tvachim samach legag, kigein something happened shenosh v'ruach v'halosei v'nimchak in Yisrael. In other words, it was about to fall, and all of a sudden the wind came, and it didn't happen. Is hoyel ve'ena hoyel l'chalanuach. In other words, now is gloy milsel mafreya that it wasn't hoyel l'chalanuach, is eni get and v'lein is garsha. So nochamo, if it lepel was noch, at the end it was noch. So she's mugureshes from when it was already higia la'aver mechitzas hagag, or it was higia lepachas mishleshet tvachim. But if a lepel was never noch, so then it comes out that she wasn't megoreshes. That's the din what we're learning here. Now, however, halacha dalet, hoya hagag shalei v'hu milmayla bei. V'hi milmata b'chotzer shalov v'zorek logit. It was fakert. He was standing on top. The gag was his, and the chotzer was hers, and he was throwing her the get. So over here the din is kivin shiyotza haget memchitzas hagag v'higia lemchitzas mekei meshihi me'etzbei. Notice now it's already within the aver of her mechitzas. In other words, let's say her mechitzas are 10 tfachim high, so it reached already lemata mi asor tfachim, whatever the height of the mechitzas, it's within the mechitzas. Is memela nizgarsha. At that point in time, she was nizgarsha, and the pashtus advarim is even in a case where at the end it ended up not being magia. Lemashal, it got burnt. A ruach came, the same case like before, and a ruach came and it ended up not being noch. Abalapel, once it was higia, the mechitzas mekei meshiyah emed is bein nizgarsha. However, zarkel l'rishusa l'techo eish v'nisraf eletecha mayim v'nimchak inevat. So in other words, we're talking about in a case where you're throwing it from the gag into the chotzer. And lepel in the chotzer there was an eish, or in the chotzer there was mayim. And lechatchila it was oimet to fall into the eish or into the mayim is eneget. Aval migiel l'rishusa v'noch v'acharka bo'eish v'sarfasi is a get. So if lepel it fell down on the floor, and then lepel was bo'eish v'ruach, so obviously it's a get. Masha'inkin if it l'chura that's poshet. Masha'inkin if it was higia l'rishusa l'chatchila al menas. This says the chiddush of migiel l'rishusa v'noch. In other words, even lepel it wasn't noch on the floor. It was noch. In other words, it was noch. It had a din of noch. Avalim higia l'rishusa and it had a din of noch. V'acharkach boa eish v'sarfosei is a reza get. So it comes out of a chiddush dika inyan here. In other words, if you're throwing it milmata l'mayla, so you're throwing it milmata l'mayla, so it comes out that it's not considered hers until lepel mamish it fell on the ground, it fell on the gag, and only then is lemafreya it's hers from when it was in the aver of the maika, or it was pachas megimel tvachim. But if it ended up not lepel mamish falling onto the gag, so in bechiyah gavna she was never megoreshes. She was never megoreshes, even though the fire or whatever came later. It was lachatchila oimet to happen, but lepel is she's not megoreshes unless it happened bepel. Masha'in came fakert when he's throwing it momayla lamata, and then it reaches already the Avraham mechitzas. So even though lepel at the end, after it reached the Avraham mechitzas, something happened, and as a result of that, it was never noch. But as soon as it reached the Avraham mechitzas, she was migureshes, and it's not mitlitalia that it should be noch bepel. If, however, Melchatchila was oimed and knows he was throwing it taka momayla lamata, but there was water there or fire there, and it was Melchatchila oimed to get burnt or to go into the mayim, so only b'chiyah gavna she's not mugureshes. The Havanas Advarim is that when you're throwing it Mulmata L'mayla, so since that's not really, in other words, Mulmata L'mayla is the Chepach HaTevet, going Mulmata L'mayla, so in order to have a din noch, it has to be noch b'peil. If it was never noch b'peil, it never had a din noch, even though it was already Teich Gimel Tvachim, or it was already Teich Avraham Mechitzes, but L'peil, since it's going Hepach, it's Teva. Masha'inkin, if it's going Mulmayla L'mata, so that's the Teva for it to be noch. So as soon as it reaches the Avraham Mechitzes, so the Meiler has a din of noch. I mean, the embassy has to still understand, because Lepel, even though you're throwing it Mulmayla L'mata, so it's taka going Hepach HaTeva, but once it reaches the Avraham Mechitzes, L'mayla, by the Gag, it's already on its way down. So since it's on its way down, so L'chur, it's already Mulmayla L'mata. And Memela, why shouldn't we say that once it reached that point in time, Memela, the Teva is that it should fall down, so it should have a din of Mugureshes right away, just like when you're throwing it Mulmayla Lamata. So the Teva is that it should go down. So as soon as it reaches the Avraham Mechitzes, it's considered that it goes down, even if it never ended up going down. So why don't you say Mulmata Lamayla, once it reaches the Avraham Mechitzes, it's also on its way down. So L'chura, at that point in time, say she's Mugureshes, even though it never Lepel reached the Gag. But it's not like that. Because since Sof Kol Sof, you threw it, you have to understand, since you threw it Mulmata Lamayla, so your essence throwing was Hepach of the Teva of the item. So therefore, Lepel, it doesn't have a din of considered Mugureshes Mamish until it was actually Noch. And then it becomes Lemafreya from either when it reached the Toich Gimel Tvachim or when it reached the Aver, the Mechitzas of the Maika. That's the din. Halacha Vav. Zorke al gabi korna or roimach hanuutzim b'rishusa. So she has a rishus, and she has mechitzas rishus, and she's aimed b'tzad rishus, but lepel, the korna or the roimach is extending higher than the mechitzas. Is any get. So it's in other words, it's not enough that she's standing there. It has to be also that it should be betoich aver hamechitzas, and therefore if lepel, it was noch, it was lepel noch, but it was noch in a place where it's l'mayla mi aver hamechitzas, so mele it's not considered a mokam mishtamer, and therefore she's not. Therefore it's not considered a ma'is in the sim. Shtei chatzeres zu lefnimi zu. Hapnimi shelo v'achitzena shalei. V'kos le'achitzena gveyes ala pnimis. So you have the outside chotzer and the inside chotzer. And the outside chotzer, his is the outside chotzer, hers is the inside chotzer. And the walls on the outside chotzer is taller than the walls of the inside chotzer. And he's throwing from the outside chotzer into the inside chotzer her get. Now, normally the din is when he throws a get into her chotzer, the get has to reach the airspace which is in the mechitzas of her chotzer. Whereas if her chotzer only has a mechitza which is gavei lamazogn 10 tvachim, so it has to be within lower than 10 tvachim. It has to reach the ear of lower than 10 tvachim. If it'll be higher than 10 tvachim, so therefore it's not mishtamer. So therefore, even though she's oimed b'tzad chatzera, so memela it's not considered she's not mugureshes. It has to be within the airspace of her mechitzas. Now over here, it's above the airspace of her mechitzas. But on the other end, his mechitzas, which is separating his chotzer from the Rishus Harabim, it's within that airspace. It's within the airspace of his mechitzas. Now, so the Maisa Zeh, his mechitzas accomplishes that the get, which is above the airspace of her chotzer apnimis, is al kol ponim mishumer from the Rishus Harabim. Whereas his walls are separating both chatzeres from the Rishus Harabim. So Mele, as far as the Rishus Harabim is concerned, this is Meshumer. And she's doch Eimed Betzida. So Mele, so as far as the Shmira between his chotzer and her chotzer, for that is enough, the fact that she's Eimed Betzida. So Mele, so it's Beseda. So in other words, she's standing Betzad Chatzera, and you have a get which is above the airspace of her chotzer. So although it's above the mechitza of her chotzer apnimis, but it's not above the airspace of the chotzer achitzena. So as far as the Rishus Harabim is concerned, it's shamur. Elamai, as far as his chotzer is concerned, so she's standing there. So for that, it's enough her standing there. That's the chiddush over here. Shtei chatzeres zu lefnimi zu apnimi shelo achitzena sholei v'kos leachitzena gveis el apnimis v'kiven shezorek haget l'teich aver hachitzena. In other words, it's in the airspace which is above her chotzer, the mechitza pnimis, but it's still beneath the height of the wall of the chotzer achitzena. That's kiven shezarek haget letoich aver hachitzena. Aver hachitzena is in the airspace which is parallel to the wall of the chotzer achitzena and is gasha. Shapnimis bekos leachitzena mishtameres. That wall which is outside the chotzer achitzena is also washing the chotzer apnimis as far as the Rishus Harabim is concerned. Masha'enkim b'kupas, but kupas that din wouldn't apply, which the Rambam is going to say the next halach. What's the din of kupas? Now kupas is not, you have to understand the tzir point of kupas. Ketza. Shtei kupas zu lefnimi zu. You have two kupas, two boxes, one inside the other. And hapnimi shelo, the inside box is hers. V'achitzena shalei, and the outside box is his. V'zarek lo gita b'techa, and he threw the get into the inside kupa. So over here the din is fakert. Afilu higia la'aver apnimis. Whereas before we were saying that even if it was higia la'aver achitzena, and it was higher than the inside wall, but lepel mamish, she's over the ground of the chotzer apnimis, and lepel it's mishtamer from the Rishus Harabim through the wall of the chotzer achitzena says beseda. But over here is afilu higia la'aver apnimis. It's within the aver of the inside kupa, eina mugureshes. Ad sheyonuach al tzad akupa pnimis, unless it is noch on the side of the kupa, and somewhere or another on the side of the kupa it was noch. It's her kupa, and it's noch on the side of the kupa. Now the tzir, the Ram says, "Bamedvor Mamurim." This whole din that he's saying that if it's noch on the tzad akupa pnimis it works, and masha'inkin if it's in the aver of the pnimis it doesn't work. Is b'shahoysa muta al tzida. We're talking about a kupa. The kupa pnimis is not standing straight; it's being muta al tzida. It's tilted, and also the ein lo shalayim. We're talking about a kupa pnimis which has no bottom. Aval yesh lo shalayim. If the kupa pnimis has a bottom, is afilu noch bekarkoisa, even if it landed on the karka of the kupa pnimis, not only the aver of the kupa pnimis, even if it landed on the karka of the kupa pnimis, is eina mugureshes. Why? Sheklei ha'isha b'reshus habal eina kena lo haget. Elim kein eina makbid al mekemis. So in other words, the kupa pnimis would be her keli, but the kupa pnimis, I mean, it depends how you learn pshat. Where is it lying over here? It doesn't really say where it's lying over here. Some people learn that it's talking about it's lying b'reshus habal. Both kupas are b'reshus habal. But if we learn the pshat is that the kupa chitzena is the baal, so memela the fact that the kupa pnimis is lying in the kupa chitzena, that means that it's lying b'reshus habal. So the kupa pnimis, which is lying in the kupa chitzena, which is reshus habal, can be koina for the isha. So l'chura the dinim, it's like hard to understand the comparison of the two dinim that we're learning over here. L'chura, the first din we learned, I mean, the din that we learned earlier was l'chura a pashta din. In other words, a din we could understand very simply. The din is azay. Her chotzer is koina for her. In other words, you can be megarashe isha normally in her chotzer when it reaches the aver of the mechitzas of the chotzer. That's when she becomes mugureshes, when it reaches the aver of her mechitza. Depending if you threw it malmata lamaila, so it has to eventually land, and if you throw it malmaila lamata, even if it didn't eventually land, as long as it wasn't oimid not to land. So, but that's the din. The din is once it reaches the aver of the walls of her mechitz, of her chotzer, the aver of the mechitzas achotzer, so she becomes muguresh. That's the din over here. Now then there's another din that even though it didn't land mamish into the aver of her mechitzas, but as long as her mechitzas is surrounded by the mechitzas hachitzenis, which is the chotzer chitzena of the baal, so even those mechitzas also help that she should be able to kena as long as it's within the airspace, the aver of the mechitzas of the chotzer chitzena. Why? Because the chotzer apnimis is mishtameres from the reshus harabim through the mechitzas of the chotzer chitzena. That was the din over there. That's l'chura. That's the din that we learned. Now the ma'aseh with the kupas, l'chura is azoi. A kupa pnimis, which is betech kupa chitzena, is not koina. Why not? Because psanudin. There's a din that kalim, her kalim can't be koina while it's in the kalim of the makna of the baal. You know, since her kupa is in the kalim of the baal, so mele it's not koina. So l'chura, that the end of that din is possible. Now, what else is we say that? What happens if you have a kupa that has no shulayim? Has no shulayim. So now we're saying that when it has no shulayim, and you throw it now, so there's a kupa of the baal. The kupa of the baal does have shulayim. That's what we're talking about. The kupa of the baal has shulayim, and you have another kupa that doesn't have shulayim. So now the chidush is that if you throw something into the airspace of this kupa that has no shulayim, you're not koinach. I mean, why should you be koinach? I mean, what does it have to do? I mean, it's in the airspace of the kupa, which has no shulayim. I mean, why should it be koina? I mean, what's the havana that it should be koina? And there's a din that if the kupa was muta al tzida, and then it fell on the kupa, so we're saying that somehow or another, if it would have shulayim, standing on shulayim, so then the bala kupa chitzena would be makbet. But masha'enkin, if it doesn't have shulayim, and it's aimed al tzida, so memela he's not makbet, and therefore she is koina. Okay, so there's a din, but l'chura, there's no comparison between this din and the din we're learning before. The din we're learning before was learning in Hilchos Chotzer. That's the din that if it's higia lechatzeira, she's koina, and the chatzeira, there's a din that it has to be to aver where she's shaychus to be koina. Masha'enkin, unless that's what he's saying gufa, that masha'enkin by kupas, it's not really his chotzer. So even though it's in the aver of the kupa, you're not koina. It's a little bit. I mean, it's a gemara really. The gemara in Gittin, the end of Gittin, but you have to understand. We'll say it again. See, he said the din benegea, the chatzar apnimis and chatzar chitzin. Then he says, and he also said the general din of chatzar. Mashenkin bekupis is going on both dinim, on the general din of chatzar maybe, and the din of kupis achitzin and chatzar apnim and chatzar chitzin. So now the Rambam continues. We'll say it again. I don't understand. Ketzat shtei kupis zu lefnim izu. Hapnim shelo v'chitzin shelo. V'zorek lo gita b'teichon. Afilu higia la'aver apnimis eina mogoreshes. Achi yanuach al tzad akupa apnimis, and being in the aver of the kupa apnimis is not enough. It's not enough. B'medvar mamurim b'shahoy semuta al tzida v'ein lo shulayim. So then it helps if it was al tzad akupa apnimis. Then it helps that it was b'tzad akupa apnimis. Aval yesh lo shulayim. So not only doesn't it help if it's be'avra chatzar pnimis, I feel enough bekarkeis ein megureshes. Sheklei isha b'rshus abal ein keno lehaget elim kein ein makbed al mekemil. I mean, we're getting the halacha, but the question is only the hashva between the din of kupis and the din of chatzar. L'chur is completely different dinim. It's not like b'sha'enkim bekupis. It's a completely different din. L'chur. Halacha ches. Zorak logita. V'hi b'tech beisoy b'tech chatzei roi is eina mugureshes achi yagia get liyoda or lekeli min hakelim shelo she'eina baal makbed al mekemeh, that he doesn't mind her having those kelim in his rishus. Kigen sluches, a kfif ktana, a small basket, a kiyetzebem. V'chein im higia lemito shelo shehi yesheves Allah v'hoyse gvei asor tvachim. So it's like chelik rishus la'atzmos, and male is considered like her rishus. So therefore, is harezim megureshes. Sharichol kerishus la'atzmo, and ve'inabal makbed al mekem kari amita. L'chol the mita standing over there through the kari amita, but nevertheless, he's not makbed on the kari amita, and this is chelik rishus la'atzmo, so it's not considered that it's in his rishus. It's like chelik rishus la'atzmo. So therefore, she becomes megureshes by throwing it on the smita shehi yesheves Allah. Okay, that's the din. Halacha tes. He didn't say specifically which mokim he's being mashal her bechatzere. And v'zorak lo get. And v'higia la'arba amis shelo shia medus b'hem, if it reaches the arba amis, it's arizim megureshes. That's pashat. So in other words, he made up with her. And normally you're not koine the aladamis in the shus of the baal. Masha'inkin over here, he made up that he was that Hishalo Habal Mokim B'Chatzeri. He didn't say specifically which, but he says, I'm giving you a place. So then, and he giya la'arba amishalo, she's catered in Zdravaseret. What happens in this galgal? V'nofel al gabi keira, al gabi seller rochik mimeno. Whereas the get taka was higia to her, to Dalar Amishalo. But from there, it was nisgalgal, and it fell on a keira, on a seller rochik mimeno. So then it depends. Imam Mokim, which was out of her Dalar Amos. Imam Mokim shenofel olav. Ein be'arba amas al arba amas. And ve'eini govei asora. And ve'ein lishem levai. So no, it's a place which doesn't have arba amas al arba amas. It's not govei asora and ein lishem levai. All three tnoim. So then it's a rezel lecholik rishus la'atzmi. So it's not a separate place. Ukilu hu vehi b'mokim echad. So therefore, even though you gave it to, he threw it to her, and it was nisgalgal chutz l'dalar amas. So since it was nisgalgal chutz l'dalar amas, so the question is if the place where it was nisgalgal could be considered also part of the mokim that he's being makner. He was the yichud lamokim. So Memele, that no, she didn't become a gureshes by the fact that it reached her and it was nisgalgal. She's actually going to become a gureshes when it lands after it reaches wherever it reaches. That's when she's going to become a gureshes. Now the question is, so that place where it's going to reach is considered the place where he was makna. Where he was mashaleh. He was mashaleh mokim b'chatzeri and not yichadeh. So within the Dalar Amos is for sure goes into that area. But over here it was nisgalgal chutz l'Dalar Amos. So the question is, if this area in which it was nisgalgal is not considered really a separate domain on itself, because it doesn't have a shem b'fnei atzmei, and it's not gavei gal dalar am, it's not gavei asor tvachim, and it's not dalar al dalid. So that's considered part of the rishus that he was makner her, even though right now it's already reached outside of her dalar ams. So therefore, chalak rishus la'atzmei, and therefore mokim echad hishalah shnei mekemis lehishalah, because he was definitely mashal the place which was next to her, and this would be considered already shnei mekemis because it's considered a chalak rishus la'atzma, and therefore ve'in mugureshes ashiyagia get liyad has to reach her mash. Zorak lo gita l'rishusa, and lepel didn't land in her rishus. V'avar b'teich rishusa she'emedis ba. But it never landed in her rishus, never stopped in her rishus. Is afal pisha avar bepachas mishleisha samach la'aretz eina migureshes achi anuach b'rishus. It has to land in her rishus. Only then is she migureshes. Mashenkin, the fact that it passed through her rishus, that's not considered that it landed in her rishus, and that would make her migureshes. Hoysa imedis al gaga v'zorkilo. And v'nafal b'gag acher samuchle. He's throwing it to her on her gag. And lepel, there's a roof, and she shares a roof with someone else. And there's two houses, and she has her roof and the roof next door. And lepel, it didn't land mamish on her roof; it landed on the roof next door. Is im yechola lifshet yadav litlay? If it's close enough, then all she has to do is stretch out her hand and take this get, even though the get didn't really land on her gag, it landed on the gag next to her. So in other words, the gag lemaila doesn't belong to her; it belongs to whoever her next door neighbor mulmata is. Just like she has the gag mulmailer, that's her gag, which is above the bias which she has mulmata, and the other people there, the gag over there belongs to the people in Mamayla, but Mamela, it's considered that it was a gil or shusa, even though it didn't really land on her own gag. Halacha Yud Beis. Hoysa yoda katafris, v'zorek hayod aget al yoda v'nafaloris. Katafris means their hands are standing, is like on a slanting downwards, and you threw the get al yoda and it fell down to the ground. Is im nafal letech arba'am b'shalav v'noch is arizim megureshes. That there's nothing to talk about. Also nafal letech hayam oy letech ha'esh. If it immediately fell letech hayam letech ha'esh ein megureshes. V'hu shehoyse imedes al gabi hamayim isamuch le'esh shemetchilas nefilase le'ibud hayemed. So since metchilas nefilase le'ibud hayemed, so memele it's ein megureshes. Masha'inkin. What about in the case? The Rambam doesn't say really. What'll be in a case where the yodi was katafris and it fell, but in lepel it ended up falling into the eish or the mayim. But lechatchila, when it was on its way falling, there was no eish or mayim, and before it actually hit the ground, there was eish or mayim. The Rambam doesn't write it. So Maggid Mishnah says that the chiyagam it's taka sofik. And what's the sofik? The sofik is if there's a din. In other words, we learned before, if it's oimed to fall down, so then you're already koina, as long as it's within the avra mechitzas and it's on its way down. So it's already koina, and even though later on came ha'eshumayim. But benigeya dalaramis, which dalaramis only a din d'rabbanan, the dalaramis is koina. So the shaila is that dalaramis is the aver, which is seifel anuach, which is oimed, that it should be seifel anuach. Is that considered also koina? That's a suffix. So the Ram only writes the vadoy says this. In the case where it was noch, it's harizim ubereshes. In the case whereas Mechatchila aimed to fall into the Eishon Mayim is beferish not Megureshes. What happens if it was Ilipel? There was Eishon Mayim, but it wasn't Oymed for Eishon Mayim. First it was Oymed to be Noch on the Karka, and Lepel at the end it was Eishon Mayim. So on that, the Maggid Mishnah says Taka Sufik, because the Sufik is if Aver She'omed Lanuach, Benigeh Dalaramis is also came. Halacha Yud Gimel. Zorkala b'Rishus Harabim, a B'Rishus She'enu Shel Shneim, is karav lei, if it's karav lei, eina mugureshes. Hoya get mechza lemechza, umi mechza lemechza achi yakarav lo, so then arizu sofik mugureshes. Hoya karav lo, kedei shetashuach v'titlenu, so then is arizu apostle. Achi yagia get liyoda v'achar kach tinosa b'lechatchila. So nochamal, if it was karav lei, there's nothing to talk about. If it's mechza lemechza, it's a sofik mugureshes. If it was karav lo kedei shetashuach v'titlenu, so then it's a rezo apostle. Ashi yagia get liyoda v'achar kach tinosa b'lechatchila. Keitzad hu karav lei Hoyu hu yachol l'shamri, v'hi eini yachel l'shamri, zehu karav lei. So if it's hu yachol l'shamri, v'hi eini yachol l'shamri, there's nothing to talk about. Einu mugurashes. Shneim yachel l'shamri. The Maggid Mishnah says shneim yachel l'shamri. Both of them could be shamri. Shneim ein yachel l'shamri. Neither of them could be yachol l'shamri alone, but they could be shamri together, because if neither of them could be shamer alone, so for sure also it's ein mugurashes, the Maggid Mishnah says. It means shneim yechelu l'shamri alone, or shneim ein yechelu l'shamri alone, only together. So that's zeu mechza l'mechza, that would go into together of mechza l'mechza. So memela, so this cut of lay, and this cut of mechza l'mechza, and then this cut of law, which is teshuach v'titlenu, and then there's a matzah when he get liyod. Bohu tchila v'amat v'achar kach amda he kenegde v'zarkilo. Whereas there's a din dalaramas is kena, but what happens? The question is who came into these dalaramas first. So he came first into dalaramas, and then she came in kenegde v'zarkilo. Ism hoya get b'tech arba amas shalei. So since the din is doch that arba amas is kena, so it's his arba amas. And she came into his arba amas, ein mugurashes. Aval pishim tashuach titlenu. And Mamela, he said before, the Ram said before that if it was cut of law, shim tashuach titlenu, it's a get possible. Over here, it's b'chlal not a get. Because why? Because it never left his rishus. It's b'tech arba amas shalei. The hit chila, ubo hu v'amad kinegdi v'zorki law, is aval pishu mechza l'mechza. And the Ram said before by mechza l'mechza, the chasofik. There's the fact that he's there as well, and it's mechza lemechza, so it's a psul d'rabbanan. But since aliba d'amis, it's her dollar amis, and her dollar amis is kena, so therefore she's definitely mugureshes minatera. The question is only that midrabbanan she's not mugureshes. Why? Because he's also there, and he's also there, and it's mechza lemechza. Achi agia get liyod. Halacha tezayin. Zorek haget liyodo. So he gives her the get, it's attached to a string, and this part of the string is still in his hand. If he could schlep the get to himself, is eina mugureshes, because that's the din. The din is there has to be a mice in the sina, and the ephon of krisus, and memela, if he's able, the natke ulavi etzle, is missing in krisus. So memela, it's not a ma'aseh gerushin. The meina yochel natke harizim mugureshes. So because that's the din. The din is that if the get is attached to a string and he's yochel natke ulavi etzle, it's missing in krisus. Now the question is, what happens when he gave the get to her? So lepel he was yochel natke. Masha'inkin later on she closed her hand, and she closed her hand. So memela, as a result of the fact that she closed her hand, he can't be menatik. Do we have to have that he should give it be'ifun kazeh that eina yochel natke, or as long as he gave it, now lepel it's a massive of eina yochel natke, is that enough? So that's be'amas ha'machlekes rishenim. Machlekes rishenim. The Rabbi Natam holds that if lepel she was kaf yoda, so then she's not megureshes, because lepel he didn't do a ma'aseh gerushin. The Ri compares it to the case where that if Lamashal, was on her, it is on his leg, and he moved his leg towards her, which showed a certain tznuah of wanting to give it to her, of giving it to her, and then she herself took it. So although he didn't do the whole ma'aseh nesina, he did part of the ma'aseh nesina, nevertheless that's considered a ma'aseh nesina. So Alderet's over here, since he gave it to her, even though lepel she was kafza, so the Ri says that the chiyai gavna it's also good. And the shaila is whether or not it's a good comparison, that case and this case. Al-Kopon, over there, Lepel, when he did a ma'aseh nesina, and that ma'aseh nesina was considered a ma'aseh nesina. Over here, Mulchatchila wasn't a ma'aseh nesina. That's the shaila in the Havana of Tesis. In Loshna Rambam, the Rambam says, Ache tiposik ha-mashicha, which the Mashmois Advarim is that even though Lepel, his ma'aseh nesina was in a way of Eina Yochel Natke, of Yochel Natke, but later on, it was Tiposik HaMashiach. It doesn't say he was not Mafsik HaMashiach. Whereas he gave it to her, is Yochel Natke, and when it's Tiposik HaMashiach, so then at that point in time, it's Chal de Gerushin. So Mashmois Advarim is that the Rambam holds like the Ri, that even if he doesn't, in the Ma'aseh Nesina, it doesn't have to be that Eina Yochel Natke. Even if the Maisa Nesina was Yochel Natke, and later on something happened which causes that Eina Yochel Natke, nevertheless it's considered a Maisa Gerushin. Halacha Yud Zayin. Nosen Haget Biyad Avdo, V'hu Neir V'hi Misham Rosei. So she gave it biyad. The question is, you want to be zeicha in this get midin chotzer. Now, where's the chotzer? The chotzer is her evet. She wants to be zeicha in the get midin chotzer because the get is lying on her evet. Is imhoya kafus. So the get was the chotzer was the evet was kafus. So Mimele is not a chotzer maleches. A chotzer maleches is not kaina. But if he was kafus and she's misham rosei, so Mimele it's a chotzer mishtamer. And she's aimed b'tzad chatzere. Memela is a get. Ki'ilu higil chatzere. She emedes b'tzida. However, if any kafis, so it's a chsarn of a chatzar mishtameres. So then is any get. Any get. However, nosni biyado eved v'hu yoshin v'hi misham rosei. So he was yoshin. So l'chur at this point in time, lepel he also can't. He's not a mahaleches. But from deswegen lepel he could be mahaleches. Therefore, he's apostle. It's possible midrabanan. If he was kafus, then Hariza Mugareshes. So according to the Rambam, kafus without Yoshin is also enough. Yoshin without kafus is not enough, but kafus without Yoshin is enough. And the Ramban holds no, that even kafus without Yoshin is also not enough. My Mishnah brings that kafus without Yoshin is not enough because it has to be Misham Rosei L'daito. Masha'en Kain, if he's not a Yoshin, so even though he's not a Mahalach, he's a kafus. But since it's not Mishamrose L'daito, because he's Mishamer himself, he's a heir, so he can't be kind for her als chotzer. So the kids, according to the Rambam, a kafus and an heir is good. According to the Ramban, it has to be a kafus and yosh. Halacha Yudches, kosev aget, v'nosni biyad avdei, and v'kosev lo shtar maton olav. He wrote a shtar maton on the evet. Is kivin shezokse be'evet, through the shtar matana is zoksa beget. So she's zeicha also in the get. Then is gasha, but im hoya kafas. In other words, again, she being zeicha lechura in the get mi hilchos chotzer because it's in her rishus in her chotzer. But on the other end, it has to be a chotzer shein mishtameres im hoya kafas. Aber v'im hoya kafas v'neir is konso avid. She's taka koine the avid because he gave him a shtar on the avid. Aber v'eina mugureshes al sheyagia get liyota. Until the get is Yagil Yodesh, she's Einam Gureshes. The Chainim Nosen Aget Bechatzere, Umochel Achotzer in Nosenlo, is Kiva Shekonsa Achotzer Beshtari Bekesev Bechazaka, is Nizgarsha. Again, because she's Kaina, Mitzad Hilchas Chotzer. No, when the get is Bechatzere, she's Kaina. So it doesn't, normally you say get is Bechatzere, she has a Chotzer, and he's giving it into her Chotzer. Over here, the word is that he's being makna her the Chotzer, and through being makna the Chotzer, so she has the get, and B'meila, that's considered a Ma'aser Nesina on the get. And every time she has a chotzer, it's really, because L'chura, since the Baal has a king in Peiris, so B'meila it has to come onto the din of Gita v'chatzera boyin keachad anyways. But I'll call upon him, this is the din, and the being makna the chotzer. And the Lashon Rambam is that if any kofus, v'neir, konso hevet, but v'eina mugureshes, at sheyagia haget liyoda, which sounds like that even though she's not Mugureshes, but once the get was Yagia Liyoda, she becomes Mugureshes. And the Rambam said it Kama Plomim. Kama Plomim things that she's not Mugureshes, but Lepel Ashi Yagia Liyoda. Over here, the Magad Mishnah is Medayik, Ashi Yagia Liyoda. Now the question is, L'chura, he gave her a get. He put the get on her Evet. And Lepel, he was Makna the Evet, on his Evet. He was Makna the Evet. So the Evet is now hers. But l'chura, the get is not hers because lepel it's on a chotzer hamalechas. It finds itself on his chotzer, but lepel is a chotzer hamalechas. And now she went ahead and takes the get. So l'chura is bepchinas ligitech me'al gabi karka. So l'chura, how does she become megurashes? But the Magad Mishnah says no. I mean, you have to understand the avonos advarim that since lepel he gave her the evet and lepel on the evet was the get, so it's keilu he gave her the get as well. Lepel, she's not Mugureshes because it's not Mugureshes because Lepel is a Chotza Malechas. But on the other hand, there was already a Maisa Nesina Mitzidoy. So a Maisa Nesina, and since there was a Maisa Nesina, and once she has it, the pale, so it's not considered Ligitach Me'al Gabekarka. It needs beer. to understand how does it work. And Be'emes, the Rashba Taka argues. The Rashba says not like that. The Rashba says that since there was, in such a case, if she's going to take the get herself, she's not going to be Megureshes. Because Lepil, since when he made the Hakna, there was no, she didn't become Megureshes, so she's not Megureshes. The fact that she's going to take the get Liyoda is not going to help. You have to understand what's the Havanas HaMachlekas over here.